Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, where of course the topic has to be energy markets. We've had some interesting things going down in the Russian space over the course of the last couple of weeks. It now looks to be pretty certain that the Russians are not going to be able to pull any sort of fast victory here, and the war is going to be a long, grinding process, really, no matter who wins, which means that anything that is necessary to keep Russian oil flowing is going to be very problematic. So if it's east of the Urals, in eastern Siberia, that is all stuff that's going to go to zero. The Russians do not have the technical expertise to operate the reservoirs, and it's just a question of whether this stuff goes offline in 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years. We don't know. We've never had the sort of collapse of technical workers in an oil field, oil zone ever before, so we don't know how fast to expect it to go offline. But we know for sure that the Russians can't do it, and we know for sure that the Chinese can't do it. You go west of the Urals, and the picture is somewhat different. There, the Russians do have the technical skills to maintain most of the output. The problem is infrastructure. And if we have a significant interruption in the flows, then pressure will build back up to the wellhead. And in the permafrost, that means that the wells get damaged, and it can take decades to repair that. So based on what happens with sanctions on the war, that can go to zero too, but it's subject to a lot of things that will happen beyond Russia. So in the east, you know it's going to go offline. The question is the timing. In the west, it's probably going to go offline, but it's subject to things that have almost nothing to do with the war. Which brings us to Alberta. Now, Alberta has been producing crude for a few decades, and their crude is a little non-standard. It's mined. Either they have to run some electricity or some steam into a reservoir to melt it out, or they have to physically mine it. Either way, it's very heavy, very high in sulfur, very thick. It's very technically difficult to recover. And that means that Albertan crude has always been on the margins of the global market. Two big reasons in addition to the quality issue. One is infrastructure. All of the pipes that bring Albertan crude to market basically flow into the United States and end up in Texas. And Texas is already a super saturated market. So a lot of times Albertan crude sells into the market at a $30 a barrel discount, which is kind of what the Russian stuff is selling on the international market for right now. Second is cost. As you might think, mining something that for everyone else is a liquid is kind of expensive. And so Albertan crude traditionally has sold for, or has had a break-even price of around $90 or $100 a barrel. So you only get a lot of activity expanding in the Albertan oil space in times when energy prices are just in times when energy prices are just through the roof. But things have been steadily changing for the last 7-8 years. Incrementally, the Albertans have managed to squeeze a little bit more oil out of every well that they've got, and incrementally they've dropped down the cost per barrel. So we're now in an environment where most Albertan crude breaks even at about 55. The average break even for Russian crude is 54. So for the first time, the Albertans are price competitive with a country that is suddenly turning into a marginal supplier. Now, all of the normal problems remain. We're moving into a capital shortage period. Oil's capital intensive, especially in Alberta. The transport issue is still an issue, but countries around the world are discovering that, the Persian Gulf is never reliable. U.S. shale might get locked in because of American domestic constraints. The Chinese are desperate for anything, and the Russian stuff is bit by bit falling off the market, and maybe tomorrow not so bit by bit. And so it was just a few weeks ago that German Chancellor Scholz came over to Canada to talk to his equivalent, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister here, to ask for anything, oil, natural gas, whatever could be got. And once you got through Trudeau's passiveness and his aggressiveness and his ideology and his brainy cosmopolitan intellectualism, the short answer was no. We're not going to see a policy shift in Ottawa on this topic anytime soon, barring significant changes in the international environment. But those changes are coming. Russian crude is going to go away. American crude is going to probably become more locked up in the market for political reasons. And that leaves Canada as one of the very few countries, and Alberta as one of the very few oil provinces on the planet that might actually be able to contribute to a solution. But it requires a policy shift first. Okay, that's it from me. Until next time. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from, where am I? California. I believe it is October 3rd. Is it October 3rd? God, I hope so. Anyway, we just got election results in from Brazil, and the situation is they do a two-rounder. You have to get 50% in order to avoid a runoff, and no one got 50%, so we are now going to have a runoff later this month between the front-runner, Lula, who is of the center-left, and the incumbent, Bolsonaro, of the center-right. Although I guess calling center-left, center-right puts it in American terms, and Brazil is absolutely its own thing. Left and right, let's just work with that. Now, the issue is that everyone thought it was going to be a blowout, and that Lula was probably going to get a first-round win, or at a minimum, just so bury Bolsonaro that there was no chance of having any serious runoff. But that did not happen. Lula got 48%, Bolsonaro got 43%. So all of a sudden, Bolsonaro and his supporters have a very legitimate reason to think that they might win in the runoff. Now, this is weird and problematic. Bolsonaro loves to say that the elections are rigged against him, and that any election that he's ever lost is because of some sort of corruption. Sound familiar to anyone? As a result, the runoff is going to be interesting. The instability is going to be very real. For those of you who are not familiar with the Brazilian situation, in many ways, it's a little similar to the United States in the way that it's set up. It's a confederal to federal system where power is shared between the municipalities and the states, and then the states and the federal government. And there is a lot of wiggle room as to who controls what in what particular area. And in areas where local governments fail, federal government steps in. In areas where the federal government fails, sometimes the localities step up. And the result from a legal point of view is a real mishmash. So it makes it very difficult to apply any sort of external approaches to looking at a political system to Brazil, because it really is its own thing. But there are some commonalities, most notably that polling does not seem to be all that right now in terms of accuracy. So now we've had a number of very high-profile elections and referendums across the world in the last several years where the numbers just didn't match what the polls said. This is true for both elections where Donald Trump was involved in the United States. This is true for the Colombian referendum on the FARC peace deal. This is true for Brexit. And now it is true for more than one run of elections in Brazil as well. Now, under normal circumstances, the concern, of course, would be that maybe Brazil is taking a page from the American book and is setting itself up for a period of extreme political acrimony and instability. But I would argue that's not all that new. What I find far more concerning is that the United States, despite its many flaws, has over 200 years of jurisprudence and legal tradition, which makes it very difficult for an individual, no matter how unique, to tear things down in a single term. If you want to take the more conservative approach, not conservative left-right, just conservative, like, let's not overreach here, you still have going back to the 1870s with Reconstruction. That's a lot of institutional heft to unwind. Brazil doesn't have that. The Brazilian system was redesigned root and branch in the 1990s as the military stepped back from direct governance and bit by bit handed control back over to the people. Part of that involved the currency and monetary policy. Part of that involved the Constitution. So we're dealing here with a system that has had peaceful transfers of power, but in the single digits. So if we do get Lula and Bolsonaro, who are two, in my opinion, not particularly enlightened or intelligent individuals, duking it out over the future of the Brazilian state, well, then we get the second largest economy in the Western Hemisphere that suddenly falls in on itself. And that has implications that will reverberate throughout the region for decades to come. Because among many, many other things, Brazil is one of the world's largest exporter of raw industrial commodities like iron ore and foodstuffs, most notably soy. And instability here will shake out into extreme global damage in a way that the world really doesn't need right now, what with everything that's going on with China and the Ukraine war. Okay, so if you're looking for something to worry about, I think this should qualify. That's it for me. Until next time.